I fell to my knees on my parents' living room floor, my hands clasped together like I was praying to two people who had stopped being capable of mercy a long time ago. "Please," I said, my voice cracking in a way I didn't recognize as my own. "I'm not asking for a gift. I'm asking for my money back. Ethan doesn't have time for you to think about it." My father didn't even look up from his coffee. "You're on your own," he said. "If your son doesn't make it, that's not our responsibility." My mother wouldn't meet my eyes either. She stared at the wall behind me and said, so quietly I almost missed it, "Consider that money repayment for everything we spent raising you." I stayed on my knees a moment longer, waiting for one of them to take it back, to laugh and say they were only testing me. Neither of them did. My father picked up his phone and called the neighborhood security patrol, and 12 minutes later I was standing outside in the cold with two men in windbreakers on either side of me, while my parents' neighbors peered through their blinds at the woman being removed from her childhood home. I stood on that sidewalk in the freezing North Carolina night and made myself a promise. I would never ask these people for anything again. Not one more dollar, not one more ounce of hope. Whatever happened next, I would build it myself. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Hannah Brooks, and 3 years before that night, my husband Tyler died in an accident that took the ground out from under my life without any warning at all. I was 29 years old with a 5-year-old son and a stack of bills that didn't care that I was grieving. I did what I had to do. I worked 2 jobs, cut every corner that could be cut, and quietly sent money to my parents whenever they called, claiming they were behind on the mortgage or needed help with a medical bill. I never once thought to ask anything back. That's what family does for each other, or so I believed. Then, Ethan got sick. It started as fatigue that wouldn't go away, bruises that appeared without cause, and a fever that lingered for weeks. The diagnosis, when it finally came, felt like the floor of my life had been pulled away for a second time. Leukemia. My son, who still slept with a stuffed dinosaur named Rex and asked me every night if I would stay until he fell asleep, was fighting for his life in a hospital in Charlotte. For months, I sat beside his bed and watched him grow thinner, watched the light in him dim just slightly with every round of treatment, and I told myself that as long as I kept moving, kept fighting for him, everything would somehow be all right. When the doctors finally found a matching donor, I thought the worst was behind us. Then, I learned that the transplant, as advanced and hopeful as it was, required a financial guarantee the hospital could not proceed without, and my insurance had exhausted what it would cover. I thought of the $100,000 sitting in my parents' hands. Months earlier, they had come to me in tears, saying they needed help renovating their aging house on Lake Norman before the whole structure gave out on them. I hadn't hesitated. I emptied nearly everything Tyler and I had saved and wired it to them within the week. I never asked for paperwork. I never asked for a repayment date. They were my parents. What I didn't know, what I only discovered the day I begged them for it back, was that the money had never gone anywhere near that house. My sister Megan's husband, Derek, a smooth-talking real estate promoter with a taste for expensive suits, had convinced my parents to invest in a luxury apartment development he was building outside of Raleigh. When I sat in their living room and asked where my son's money had gone, Megan called me emotional. Derek said something about how business decisions couldn't be unwound just because I was in a difficult moment. And my parents, the two people who raised me, chose to defend a stranger's investment scheme over their own grandson's life. That was the night I knelt on their floor. That was the night security walked me out into the cold. I drove back to the hospital with my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. I sat in the parking garage and cried until I had nothing left, and then I wiped my face, walked back inside, and sat beside Ethan's bed, because that was the only thing I knew how to do. I held his hand while he slept, and I whispered promises to him that I had no way of keeping. I told him he was going to be fine. I told him his mother would find a way. I didn't know where that way was going to come from. I only knew I refused to stop looking for it. The next afternoon, a hospital social worker named Patricia found me in the family waiting room and told me someone had been trying to reach me for days. She said an elderly man had come to the hospital claiming to be a relative of Tyler's, and that the hospital's legal office had spent nearly a week verifying who he was before they allowed him near our file. I had no idea what she was talking about. Tyler's family, as far as I knew, consisted of a mother who had passed years earlier, and no one else. Minutes later, a tall man in his 70s walked into the waiting room, leaning slightly on a cane, dressed simply, but carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that made the room feel smaller. He introduced himself as William Whitmore. He said he was Tyler's grandfather, estranged from the family for reasons that had more to do with an old falling out over Tyler's father than anything Tyler himself had done. He said he had learned, almost by accident, through an old contact who still worked in the county records office, that his great-grandson was fighting for his life in a hospital less than 30 miles from where he lived. "I should have found you both years ago," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like grief. "I don't intend to lose any more time." I remember staring at him, half expecting this to be some kind of mistake, some cruel misunderstanding that would collapse the moment anyone looked closely at it. But William Whitmore did not make promises he couldn't keep. Within the hour, his attorney, a calm and precise man named Nathan Caldwell, met with the hospital's financial office and provided an unconditional guarantee covering every dollar the transplant would require. I sat in the hallway and watched doctors and nurses begin moving with a new kind of urgency, an urgency that meant something was finally actually happening for my son. "Why are you doing this?" I asked William later that evening, once the paperwork was signed and Ethan was being prepped for surgery. He looked at me for a long moment. "Because he's my family," he said. "And because, from what I understand, you've spent your whole life being the only person willing to show up for the people you love. Someone should show up for you, too." I won't pretend the surgery was easy, or that the weeks that followed were anything but terrifying. There were fevers that frightened us, setbacks that made the doctors furrow their brows in ways I tried not to read too much into. There was a night, about 10 days in, when Ethan's temperature spiked so high the nurses moved him to intensive monitoring, and I sat outside his room until sunrise, convincing myself that I had not come this far only to lose him now. But slowly, his body began to accept what had been given to him. Slowly, the color returned to his cheeks, and the shadows under his eyes began to fade. The day he sat up in bed, grinned at me with more energy than I'd seen in months, and asked for macaroni and cheese instead of hospital gelatin, I cried harder than I had the night my parents turned me away. It was, without question, the best sound I had heard in over a year. Once Ethan was strong enough to come home, I made a decision that surprised even me in its finality. I changed my phone number. I moved to a different part of Charlotte. I did not send my parents my new address, did not answer the emails Megan occasionally sent trying to explain herself. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in protecting my son from ever again being in a room with people who could look at him and decide he wasn't worth the inconvenience. William noticed something about me during those months at the hospital that I hadn't fully noticed about myself. While other families around us panicked over paperwork, insurance codes, and hospital billing disputes, I had methodically gone through every statement line by line, caught errors the hospital's own staff had missed, and negotiated corrections without raising my voice once. "You have a mind for this," he told me one afternoon, watching me organize a stack of insurance documents at Ethan's bedside. Not the money, the composure, the way you think when everything around you is falling apart. A few months later, once Ethan was steady and back in school, William offered me something I never expected. Not charity, which I would have refused, but a position, a paid fellowship inside Whitmore Capital, his investment firm, starting at the very bottom with no guarantees and no shortcuts because of who had recommended me. I said yes before I had time to talk myself out of it. My first weeks at the firm were humbling in a way I hadn't prepared for. I was assigned a small desk near the analysts, most of them younger than me by a decade, and I remember sitting through my first meeting, understanding perhaps a third of what was actually being discussed. I stayed late every night that first month, teaching myself the language of balance sheets and acquisition terms, determined that no one would ever have reason to say I had been given something I hadn't earned. Slowly, the unfamiliar words became familiar. Slowly, I stopped being the woman who nodded along and became the one asking the sharpest question in the room. The 2 years that followed were some of the hardest of my life, and also some of the most transformative. I learned private equity investing from analysts half my age who assumed I wouldn't last a month. I learned commercial real estate by making mistakes that cost the firm real money and owning every one of them. I studied business acquisitions late into the night after Ethan was asleep, and I sat through negotiations that taught me more about human nature than any book could have. Nothing was handed to me. Every promotion I earned came because I outworked the doubt that followed me into every room. I won't claim I always believed I would make it. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table with spreadsheets I didn't understand yet, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake leaving behind the life I knew, however painful it had been. But I thought of Ethan asleep down the hall, healthy because a stranger had chosen to show up when my own blood had chosen not to, and I kept going. Eventually, William began entrusting me with something harder than spreadsheets. He gave me struggling companies inside the Whitmore portfolio, the ones other executives avoided because they were too broken to be worth the trouble. I found I had a gift for exactly that kind of trouble. I uncovered financial fraud that had gone unnoticed for years in one subsidiary. I renegotiated a contract that saved another from collapse. I rebuilt trust with employees who had every reason to expect another round of layoffs, and instead watched their company turn a profit for the first time in 3 years. 2 years after the night my parents had me removed from their home, William Whitmore appointed me Chief Operating Officer of Whitmore Capital. While I was building that life, I later learned, my parents' world was quietly falling apart. The luxury development Derek had convinced them to invest in never recovered from a downturn in the regional market. To keep it alive, Derek pressured my parents into co-signing loans they didn't fully understand, using the home they had lived in for 30 years as collateral. When the project finally collapsed, Derek filed for bankruptcy in his name only, and within weeks, he and Megan had vanished from the lives of everyone who once depended on them. The banks foreclosed not long after. My parents lost the house on Lake Norman. They lost their retirement. They lost nearly everything they owned, all because of the very greed that had once made them choose a stranger's investment over their own grandson's life. I didn't celebrate when I heard. I felt something closer to sorrow, the kind you feel watching two people you once loved dismantle their own lives with their own hands. 2 years to the exact week after that freezing night on their sidewalk, Whitmore Capital hosted a charity gala benefiting families fighting childhood cancer, an event I had spent months helping build from nothing. I stood at the podium that evening and told the room about a boy who almost didn't make it, and about the foundation we were launching to help families who found themselves exactly where Ethan and I once had. The applause that followed didn't feel like triumph. It felt like purpose. As I was leaving the ballroom afterward, I saw 2 figures near the valet entrance who stopped me cold. My parents. Older than I remembered. Thinner, wearing clothes that had clearly seen better years. My mother's eyes were red. My father, who had once refused to look up from his coffee, could barely look at me at all. "Hannah," my mother said, her voice breaking around my name, We didn't know any of this was you." They told me everything then, standing there in the cold in a way that mirrored the night they'd once had me removed. They admitted they had lied about the renovation. They admitted Derek had manipulated them into risking everything they owned. They admitted, finally, that they had chosen appearances and easy money over their own grandson's life, and that no explanation would ever make that choice smaller than it was. Then they asked me for one thing, a place to stay, just until they got back on their feet. I listened to every word without interrupting, the way I had learned to listen in boardrooms full of people trying to convince me of things that weren't true. When they finished, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "The night Ethan needed you most," I said, "you decided we were no longer your family. I accepted that decision 2 years ago. I'm simply respecting it now." I told them I hoped they found peace, and I meant it, but I did not open a door they themselves had closed. Hotel security escorted them quietly from the property, and there was no scene, no shouting, nothing that resembled the ending I might once have imagined for people who hurt me so deeply. There was only the quiet, final weight of consequences they had built for themselves, one decision at a time. When I got home that night, I found Ethan already asleep, having proudly told his teacher earlier that day that his mother had helped start a foundation for kids just like him. I stood in his doorway for a long moment, watching him breathe, healthy and whole in a way I had once begged the universe to let him be. I realized, standing there, that I already had everything I had once knelt on a floor and pleaded for. Love, safety, a future no one could take from us. Family, I understood now, was never about blood. It was about the people who choose to stand beside you when everything around you is falling apart. The people who show up when there's nothing in it for them except doing what's right. I closed Ethan's bedroom door softly and allowed myself, finally, to feel something I hadn't let myself feel in a very long time. Peace. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that real strength often looks like quiet endurance rather than loud revenge, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. We tell stories about people who were tested by the very family who should have protected them, and who found the courage to build something better on the other side of that betrayal. Every subscription helps us keep bringing these stories to life. And if you take one thing away from Hannah's journey tonight, let it be this. The people who abandon you in your darkest moment do not get to decide who you become in the light that follows. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't the one you chase, it's the one you build, quietly, one honest day at a time, until the life you've created speaks louder than anything anyone ever said about you. There is real value in a story like this, beyond its emotional pull. It shows how financial exploitation can hide inside family relationships, disguised as help or obligation. And it reminds viewers of the importance of protecting themselves even when love makes that difficult. It illustrates the power of chosen family and unexpected kindness, showing that support can come from the most unlikely places when we least expect it. It offers a lesson in resilience, proving that a person's worst moment does not have to define their future if they are willing to work honestly towards something better. Finally, it teaches that true justice rarely needs to be loud. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is simply living a life so full of integrity and purpose that it speaks for itself.